Very good evening, everyone. We're very glad to welcome you at our Legal Writing Webinar Series 2025. And today, tada, we have our final webinar with our wonderful Dr. Heather Weger. And after this webinar, just a couple of our elements about the logistics. After this webinar on weekend, we will have a test, which is free online test. If you would like to receive a certificate after you have watched this series, please take it. You will have 2 days to take it. We will submit all of the rules and technicalities about it. You will receive them are on Saturday morning, and you are very welcome to look through all of the webinars we had, and there you will find all of the answers. And I just wanted to remind you that today our session will consist of two parts. The first part is theoretical part with Heather, and we're going to discuss the final topic. And then we will switch to an interactive session, which is not recorded, but all of you will receive the materials that we discuss at the session. And those of you who received the link for the interactive session will just need to switch to it. So I think I'm done with all the technicalities. If you want to, you can submit your questions into our YouTube, Contacte, or into our chat. And Heather, the floor is yours for the last time.
For the last time. Well, thank you so much, Sophia, and welcome to everyone who has tuned in tonight or who is watching this offline at some other point. We are excited for the final session. It's what we call a bittersweet moment, so it's exciting, but also, of course, sad that this part of the journey is quickly coming to its close. Today, as Sophia said, we have our final topic, and we do want to end strong. We're going to be thinking specifically tonight about our language choices and how our language choices are how we can communicate a clear message in our legal writing. So I'd like to remind you that I am not a lawyer. I am a linguist, but I work in the field of legal English, and I teach legal writing courses at a university in the Washington, D.C. area. And I am excited to talk with you tonight about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and we will see if I can convince you to fall in love with it as well, and that is the way that language functions within the sphere of the law. Now, what we have been working on is building up sort of a repertoire of principles for how legal writing works in the U.S. context. And we began in our first webinar by focusing on how we write in order to meet expectations of our readers. We then moved to the topic of how we follow expected conventions for the ways in which writers are expected to cite to law in our second webinar. In our third webinar, we turned to some organizing principles. So legal arguments, legal points are, of course, rather complex. And how are we going to bring our reader along for the argument that we're building? So we started that organizational journey by thinking about how the chain of definitions can help as an organizing principle in our third webinar. In our fourth webinar, we talked about the way in which comparisons is a critical organizational function that happens when you are citing to law within your argument. In the fifth webinar, so what we worked on 2 weeks ago, were other strategies for guiding readers through multiple pages of legal logic. And that leads us to think about the way that language works in all of these systems. In our first 5 webinars, we focused on the tool of genre. At least that's the tool that I've been using. It is a linguistic tool, and what it provides for me so that I can provide it to you is a way of understanding the shared features of text types and how that functions for particular discourse communities. And of course, in our situation, we're talking about how language functions, how shared features function for the legal community. So we had a heavy focus on the different logic features as well as organizational features in our first 5 sessions. And that inherently led us to talk about language, but tonight we are going to sit squarely in the frame of language and how language functions in order to create the way a text sounds. So what I want to do before we jump into the examples that I have for you tonight is I'm going to give Sophia her weekly quiz. So Sophia, I hope you're ready for your weekly quiz. We're going to start by thinking about what language even means. And I like to think about it in terms of metaphors, because language is, after all, in and of itself, somewhat abstract. So I'm going to give you a couple of choices. And Sophia, I'd like to know which of these choices seems the most interesting to you. So sometimes I like to think of grammar as the mixing of ingredients, right? The individual ingredients themselves might be vocabulary elements or elements of grammar. And then the way in which you construct them, what you put in, what you leave out, how you mix them, is the ending recipe. So it is both a little bit of a science and an art, another way of thinking about the metaphor of grammar. There are ways in which language is rule-based, very systematic, and then there are also ways in which language represents a fluidity and choice and style. And so these two work in tandem. And the third metaphor that I would give to you is the actual metaphor coming from the law. In the U.S. context, we have talked about how law breaks down in general into statutes and case law. And if we think of statutes as being a set of somewhat static rules that are stipulated top down from the legislative bodies, we can contrast that with the case law, which is built up over time through a set of precedents. And this is similar to language because language has certain rules, making it similar to statutes, but language also is fluid, and the way in which we use language builds up over time and changes over time, and that makes it feel more like a precedent or case law. So Sophia, here is your weekly quiz. What does language mean to you, or which of these metaphors resonates most with you?
Oh, that is horrible. Heather, what you do with me? So I would say language, first of all, is a miracle to me. And I'm fascinated with language because it allows to express us are on a level that is unprecedented. And I would say that to me, all of these are applies because sometimes language is really an art, and some people I read make beautiful writing pieces, and it's amazing, and I'm fascinated with them. Sometimes, yes, especially how I very often I teach language. It's really a recipe. You just need to take this, and this, and you, as a result, will get this. So sometimes it is like mathematics, and to me, very often it's not like cooking, but maybe building Lego blocks, especially in terms of English language, if you look at the basics of grammar. So I would say that it depends on so many factors.
And that
it
is
depends
what
on.
makes language very, very, as you said, beautiful, right? Language is magical. It has this power to lead to expression. And
Yes.
one thing that I have found when working with emerging writers, especially those who are new to the U.S. legal system or U.S. legal language, it's an overfixation on the mechanics of grammar, to which I would respond, grammar is nothing. Whether you have forgotten to make it plural or singular, S or no S, is not what is critical to your meaning. On the other hand, what I'm going to explore tonight is that in some ways, grammar, vocabulary, language is everything, because it is the medium through which logic, organization, and attitude are made visible to the reader. So well done on your final quiz, Sophia. So we'll take a look now at language more deeply through 3 blocks of examples. The first block, we're going to take a look at how language functions to show the logic. The example I'm going to give to you here is how language shows the purpose of what is being written. So this hopefully will look familiar to some of you who have been watching us throughout the series. This is our 3-piece view of the elements of the genre for any given text type. And what we see here is that the language feature that we're focusing on for this moment is how language functions to express the logic. So we looked in our first webinar at a chart similar to this one, where we examined different types of purpose that are encoded by the choice of the writer in terms of the writer's language. So often what we see is the use of verbs is the way that it is visible, that we are trying to persuade or record information, if we're trying to make a prediction, or if we're trying to make a declaration stating what a law is. Here is an example from an office memo. We focused on office memos that were predictive. There can be many different types of office memos, but many of them are intended to be predictive. And we can see here that I've highlighted some of the language that gives the reader the understanding that the writer is predicting what is going to happen in certain circumstances. So we have, it is reasonable to conclude. The writer is fairly certain here, relying on the logic, showing that it is the logic, but not stating it as a fact. And also we have the courts would likely. So the writer is not definitively able to say what a court is going to do, but the writer is able to tell you the strength of the writer's prediction based on the research the writer has done, and they summarize that in a sentence like this. The second example is the use of language to show a persuasive purpose. So appellate briefs, unlike the memo, the appellate briefs are intended to be persuasive. They are advocacy documents. So here the language is more of an advice. You should do this. Like we are trying to persuade you to make a change or to rule in a certain way based on the logic that we have given you, right? And then our third example coming from a court decision is to show the language around this idea of a declarative purpose. So I have highlighted here the verbs, which are often one very obvious way in which your language choice indicates what your purpose is. Now, if we take a look at our second block, we're going to break it actually into two pieces. The first is really pretty simple, takes about 30 seconds. The second one is going to be a little bit more detailed. But for this first block, what we're going to talk about is how language can show the reader the moves of a genre. And by moves, what we mean are the way in which the genre, the text type is broken down, how it's sort of grouped, what are some of the expected circumstances that the text is going to deal with. So here we are back on our review slide, and we can see we're moving on now to organization features and this idea of the moves. The example I chose to bring to you guys is the example we worked with last week, where we were talking about headings. And headings can function as one type of roadmap to signal the way in which a text is organized. And we looked at headings in terms of how we take long pieces of text and we cluster them into smaller paragraphs and give labels to those paragraphs, right? And there is an example from 2 weeks ago when we had our last session about the many different types of headings that can be used, and the type of heading varies depending on the type of document you are trying to produce. In other words, who the writer is and what purpose the writer has for writing. The example that we looked at comes from an article, a law review article. So we took a look at how the headings here can be divided into both types of headings, functional and informative. And then we're going to look later, we're going to return to that heading and talk a little bit more about other language features there. But very quick, very simple, one way in which language helps us in terms of the logic device is it helps us with our headings. Now, this is going to be a really fun space for me to play in. So, Sophia, I have to warn you and warn our audience that we are about to look at some grammar. All right, so if grammar is not something that you're really that interested in, this would be a good chance to like stretch your legs or check your phone. But for those of you who have a curiosity about the mechanics of the way grammar reveals its magic, then you're going to enjoy these next 5 or 6 minutes. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how language shows relationship between ideas. And the way language does this is through its grammar. So here we're going to move down to our second question. We're leaving moves behind and we're moving over to signaling organization on a sentence by sentence level. So we've left headings and we are now inside of paragraphs. All right, so the article that, or the example that I'm going to show to you comes from an article that you are now very familiar with. It is our law review article that we've looked at by Kelly Wilson called Catching a Unique Rabbit. And as you will probably remember, the focus of the article is on proposing a new legal framework for dealing with claims that come to court where pets have been injured or killed due to the actions of others. So pets are classified as property, and Wilson dissects the ways in which the current legal system offers remedies, offers damages, that is money compensation for those individuals whose animals have been injured or killed. So she analyzes that and proposes her own solution. There are 5 paragraphs in the section that we're going to look at, and do not worry, we are not going to look at all 5 paragraphs, but they are here for you. They're on the screen. So at some point, if you want to stop and take a closer look at them, you can. I believe it's a total of 22 sentences across the 5 paragraphs. So it's not an incredibly long text. Where are we in her argument? So you can see at the top of the screen, it says that we're in section 3C. So section 1 was her introduction. And in section 2, she gives us a historical look at how animals as property have been dealt with over time.
Yeah, I remember we discussed this when we talked about, so I don't know, I remember webinar 2 or 3, we discussed there was the history and everything. So we looked at it. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And this is going, when I show you the title for the section, I think you might, it might ring a bell because it's a question that you asked me, I think last week. Right? But in section 3, she begins to break apart what possible solutions currently exist. And you might remember that she doesn't like any of the current possible solutions, right? So we are looking at her third proposed solution, and she's going to tell us why it won't work, right? So that's where we are. And now here we have our first paragraph. So we will look at the first paragraph. Now, Sophia, do you see anything in there that seems familiar to questions you've asked over our 5 weeks?
Oh, yes. So our Campbell exception, punitive damages. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So we are coming back to what is the Campbell exception and why will it not work, right? So the color coding that you see here, it's really just trying to grab your attention so you get the main idea that we are dealing with. Campbell exception, it is out there. It is a legal possibility. It does allow for punitive damages, but she's going to show us that it still isn't the best solution. Okay. All right, so let's just take a moment here in our first paragraph. I'll give us a moment to read through it. I'll read it quite quickly for us. In the majority of pet loss cases where the court uses the, in the majority of pet loss cases where the court uses the market value approach to assess damages for the loss of a pet, that amount, if any, will be very small. Should the pet's death arise in a malicious manner that justifies an award for punitive damages, it is also likely that this award, even if relatively modest, for instance, under $3,000, will violate U.S. Supreme Court standards that require an appropriate ratio between actual and punitive damage awards. However, 2 exceptions may apply that can suspend the strict application of the ratio. The first exception applies in cases where the second exception is applicable where. So what we have in our paragraph is that there is a limit, but there is a way to get around that limit if we can fall under these two exceptions. So now we are ready to jump into what we will do with our analysis here. We're going to take a look at, first of all, the entire 5 paragraphs. And one way in which we show relationships between ideas that are quite commonly known are called traditional transition words. So words like moreover, therefore, on the other hand. There's a lot of words that are known within both legal and non-legal spaces for writing and connecting ideas. Interestingly, they are used, but not as frequently as you might expect, because we more frequently use something called a substantive transition. And I'm going to give you an example of both. So if we take a look at traditional transitions, they pop out at us pretty quickly, words like however and therefore. You might notice by glancing at the screen that each paragraph only uses one of these words. Paragraph 1 has one, paragraph 2 has one, paragraph 3 has none, paragraph 4 has one, paragraph 5 has actually two. One that's inside of the paragraph, that's the word, the phrase, for instance, and then a special word, therefore, at the beginning. So, and we, what that is indicating is that therefore is often found at the beginning of the last paragraph of a section.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that she's not using synonyms. So she's using just however, however, however. That is interesting because we're usually taught that you need to use the synonyms and not repeat one word. So, you know, but it's not a big thing. Yeah.
And however is, I would, from the analyses that I have done, however is very prominent in legal writing. It is a common way to highlight the contrast. Certainly it's not the only way. There might be the word but hanging out somewhere in these 5 paragraphs. But what you see less frequently are some words like moreover, additionally. So those types don't appear nearly as frequently as we expect them to. If we go to what does happen more frequently that people aren't necessarily aware of, that's what I want to focus on in terms of the substantive transition. So it's a way to use grammar that allows you to introduce information or repeat information. And that introduction and repeating is a way to actually show the connections between ideas. And it's actually very commonly used. You're maybe not just accustomed to thinking of it that way. So if we go back to our first paragraph that I read to you, I've highlighted where you can see those substantive transitions. We have the however 2 exceptions, and then the writer breaks them down, the first exception, the second exception. This is a roadmap strategy where you're guiding the reader to see the main idea, 2 exceptions, and then you break them down a step at a time. Right? It's very common to use in first paragraphs to help prepare the reader for the analysis that's coming. If we take a look at what happens when we go from paragraph 1 to paragraph 2, I'll show you one more example. So here is paragraph 1, just on the screen so you have it as a reference. 2 exceptions, the first exception, the second exception. These are the Campbell exceptions, right? Now, when you're writing, what I want you to keep in mind is that all writers have choices. So the writer now wants to move into why these exceptions are not going to be as satisfactory as you might think, right? So the way in which you are showing your logic, you're bringing up a legal topic, and now you're trying to show why that legal topic does or doesn't work, and you're connecting paragraphs, you're building a chain of your logic. So a lot of that work happens in that first sentence to show the reader that connection. So you could write, the writer could choose to say something like, the argument makes a lot of sense, because what's being described in the first paragraph is this argument about these exceptions, and that these exceptions can work for pets, right? The writer could have also said the exceptions make a lot of sense, right? Because the exceptions are the aspect of the argument that the writer is focused on. But what Wilson actually did was neither of these two choices. She did a grammar choice. She has the argument that these exceptions, and then she explains what the exceptions are. Entitle the pet owner to a larger recovery. Makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to break that down for you just so you see the grammar very quickly. The argument is abstract. If your reader is trying to follow something that's complex, what do you, the writer, mean by the argument? Which argument are you really referring to? The reader might benefit from having it explained in detail. The way you do that is with a that clause. And after the that clause, you can have the these and a summarizing phrase. So exceptions is a placeholder here because that's what we're talking about in this particular example, but it could be any other type of noun that is a way to refer back to the same idea. And here you have what we call keyword recycling. Right? So now the reader for paragraph 2 is seeing a summary of what the writer was trying to do in paragraph 1. One final example here, and then I'll stop torturing you with some look at grammar, is if we move between paragraph 2 and paragraph 3, we also need to make a connection. What is the relationship between both of them? So in paragraph 2, after giving that summary sentence in sentence 6, the writer talks about the however, why it's not going to work. And the focus here is on this word punitive and misconduct. And so when she goes into paragraph 3, she wants to talk more about what that conduct is. She could just start with, courts will consider a number of factors. But that leaves the reader to guess or assume what the court is actually considering. Yeah. So it's better to mention it. So these are my 2 grammar examples, Sophia. What type of questions do you have for me?
I do not have yet the type of questions. I have a comment that this is, let me read it. So that this is super difficult and I didn't expect it to be so detailed and so much thought behind it. I think our viewers might be horrified a little bit.
Okay, that's why it's recorded. They can stop and rewind and watch it again, right? The fun thing about this moment in our 6 minutes or 7 minutes here in Grammarland is that I want you to see when you are building connections, you might be surprised at the number of ways in which those connections are actually constructed, are actually built. On this one screen here, I've highlighted in sentence 6 this idea of the that, which is a very common construction in English. But it doesn't have to be that. It can also be an infinitive. We have to determine, right? So that's a different type of grammar structure, but they allow the writer to guide the reader in connecting the paragraphs of the logic.
I think what might fascinate and surprise our viewers is how much work there is and thought and thinking and actually labor, which is hidden behind just like several paragraphs. So when you look at it, it's like when you see the skeleton, you understand that every word, the position on every word or every grammatical structure has a meaning and it's a logic. So that's, I think, what may be really surprising to many of our viewers. That's how much work was invested into creating this and how much thought was invested into this.
And of course, over time, some of this becomes, depending on who you are as a writer, it's not something that you do consciously as much anymore, right? You've learned by when you are reading what other people have written, and your brain is thinking about, wow, I understood that. That was a very clear argument, right? What you're doing is, as lawyers, you're detectives. You are detectives at how situations match to the laws of your system. Right? And that's really what language is doing here. You are a detective figuring out how language is the way in which you show the connections between the ideas. And the takeaway for me from looking at these 2 or 3 examples of grammar is that grammar is flexible. It's the way that you give a voice to your logic. It's the way that you show your logic. And the more detailed elements of it, whether it's a that or an infinitive or repetition of words, those are some of the little ingredients that over time you learn how to put together as you're baking the recipe that you're baking. Well, I am excited to tell you that that is the last of our examples there. So there's a little bit of grammar language on there for you. So as you review paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 later, you can have a deeper look at what's happening with the vocabulary choices, the repetition of those vocabulary choices, and also some of the grammar.
Yeah, we usually study these overlapping like dovetail techniques, so we discuss it, but it's deeper into language. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if anyone was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can handle this, you can come back now. The grammar moment is over. And we're moving into our last set of examples, which is the way that language functions as voice, right? So it shows attitude, and it shows confidence as one component of attitude, right? So when we go back to our visual here, our 3 components, and we take a look at the final one, language features, we're back to this idea of how writers use words to convey sound, the sound of the speaker, the style of the speaker or the writer in our situation, of course. So I mentioned earlier that I would return to this set of headings from the Law Review article. And of course, it matches those 5 paragraphs that we were looking at. Right? So here I've highlighted within section 3 some of that language that indicates the attitude of the writer, so that we know not only what the topic is, but we know how the writer wants us to think about that topic. Another example that we have looked at in our time together came from the appellate brief. And similarly, these are the headings from one of the 2 briefs. There's a petitioner and a respondent. This is the petitioner's brief. And again, I color-coded the language that helps us see not just the topic, but also the way in which the writer wants us to respond to that topic, or the attitude that the writer has about that topic. And then we can go into the final thought about language. Language can also demonstrate the confidence of a writer. So I have here a quote that I thought I would have us read together. And I'm curious to know how issues of confidence are managed in your legal system, Sophia, or the legal system for anyone who's watching. So when we are training our legal writers, we want to reinforce to them that often it is not possible for them to give a definitive yes or no to a client, right? There are so many nuanced elements to any particular case. And because of that reality, many lawyers use what we call qualitative probability expressions. So words like unlikely, probably. It can also be words like through the verb choices, might, could, right? There's many different ways that you can indicate that you're less than 100% sure. So I'm curious, Sophia, how your legal system deals with the issue of confidence. Are you expected to make a prediction about the system with a high level of confidence, or are you allowed to equivocate when writing?
Yeah, we will wait for our viewers if they can submit any of their comments. I understand. So, and while we're waiting, and I will look then at the comments, I would say that there is always a problem with balance because on one hand, the lawyer is working for the client, but there is a problem with not over-promising, not to be too positive. So, and are how, at least what I see. So, and we also use a lot of words like this. And on one hand, clients, customers always want to have certainty, yes or no. On the other hand, lawyers need to protect themselves because if they overpromise, what happens if there is unfortunate outcome of the case? So,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
they
And that's
maybe
the
encourage
fundamental
the client too
root of
much.
it.
Yeah, it's always a problem. So of course, the guidelines usually, from what I can see, especially in consulting law firms, especially an executive summary or as a quick and direct answer immediately after the issue in memo or email to the client, is to give as more specific answer as possible. So probably yes. So or so no one will write definitely. So they will always use this. Most probably yes. So yes, there may be some damages that you need to pay out. So it's two ways where to find the balance between the promise, not over promising, and assuring a client. It's a problem. So I think it's a universal issue for many, many, many. Yeah.
It is. And so I have two thoughts I want to make before I wrap up. And one is that because of this sort of universality of the need to equivocate, to hedge, to indicate the possibility of it not going the way you think it's going to go. When writers make statements like it is obvious or unquestionably, these types of claims are problematic. They are asking the reader to just assume the logic is correct or accurate or effective. And so when building arguments, it's not only when you come down to give the one sentence answer, probably yes, probably no, but it's in the way in which the logic is constructed, the way in which it's presented to the reader, where whenever you find yourself writing things like it is obvious, or it is clear, or it is undeniable, those are moments where, as the writer, you take the step back. Oh, I just wrote that. Why did I write that? How do I prove that? And that goes into what you were saying, Sophia, about the difficult sentence by sentence work it takes to build a solid argument, rather than how you doing something very, very quickly and thinking that the logic is clear to someone else. That was one point I wanted to make. The second point that I wanted to make is about what you're seeing here on the screen, about the way we show confidence in our conclusionary statements. So when we are writing, writers need to indicate their confidence, of course, in their predictions about the court, whether it's saying that it's unlikely in a predictive memo, or whether it's using words like should. We saw that in the appellate brief. But also, you want to indicate confidence in the predictions about counter arguments. We don't know for sure what counter arguments might be raised by opposing counsel. So here we see verbs like could or might. Now, it's interesting to me as well. I really wanted to try to end our series with a look at not just the lawyer as writer, but the lawyer as judge, as writer. And so judges are also conveying tone, specifically in terms of raising possible counter arguments or concerns. So when the judge anticipates that how someone is going to receive a decision that the court is making, even then you will see that the writer is expected to acknowledge and give space to the counter arguments, the possible other interpretations that might exist for something that they have written, even if it is written by a lawyer judge. So that actually brings us to our, oh yes, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I wanted just to go, if you can go back just one page. Yeah, it was really interesting. I'm sorry for interrupting you. It was really interesting to see how human the language is of the holding of a judge. So the state need not worry that our holding will disable it from preserving the peace. So it's really like you see a person behind it. It's not like neutral, distant. That is very interesting. So
this particular example here, we looked at this earlier in our series, not last week, but earlier in our series, or 2 weeks ago. And it was written in 1989. And we're, of course, in this era now where you might hear about the plain English movement.
Yeah.
Right. So clearly you can even see as long ago as 1989 that there is this trend to be somewhat conversational in the way in which the logic is presented, right?
Yeah.
So that it engages with the reader and provides that conversation space.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually kind of brings us to our end. So we have journeyed from webinar 1 to webinar 6. We've opened up the hood of the car and taken a look at how the systems work. And I love to end with what you said about language being sort of magical, because there is something magical about the way in which writers take all of the different choices that they have and put them together and construct a beautiful feast of a language in the context of legal writing.
Yes, it is wonderful. Thank you so much, because you managed to guide us through really the mechanics which are hidden behind the text. And as I said, I would say that the most of the surprise, I think, and discovery for many of our viewers is how much effort, how much thought, how much focus on the logic is hidden behind. And I think to many of us, and I saw it in the comments from our viewers, that to many viewers and participants, the turning point was the idea of reader focus writing, that you constantly think, as you said today, you always take a step back and think, will it be understandable? So will the person who is reading, depending on the genre, will the person who is reading my piece of writing understand correctly what I mean? So it's very interesting how much energy is hidden behind all of this. So, and how difficult it is to teach. Heather, I think it's really difficult to teach. So, and actually, we do have one last question from our viewers, and then we'll switch to our interactive session. There is a question from Tatiana about which element do your students find the most difficult to study? I don't know which element, so maybe like the concept or the topic. So
that's a really interesting question. You know what, Tatiana, and anyone it's somewhat changing now. You know, this series did not delve into any sort of AI technology, artificial intelligence technology, and the impacts that that's having on legal writing. But I believe the way I would answer that question is that every individual struggles with something that is unique to that individual. However, there does tend to be a fairly uniform struggle to recognize the need to cite to other law, how that happens so frequently. Virtually every sentence has some sort of citation with it, and just breaking through that understanding about why that is needed, or why maybe even needed isn't the right word, but why that's expected. If you're not doing that, the reader of your document is going to not value what you're saying. They're going to question that you've done your research because you're not citing to your research, right? And the second thing that I would identify that students are really struggle with a lot is the need to draw specific connections between the facts of cases. I remember reading once that new writers may struggle with why they need to know the facts of various cases, right? So it is the facts that constitute the law. And so that wrapping your head around that need. And then those are conceptual needs. Now, once I've understood it and I've identified the facts, or I've identified the source, how do I then write about it? How do I then organize it, right? So it is a chain throughout the 6 different webinars that we've had.
Yeah, super. Thank you so much for answering this. And everyone, so we're officially wrapping up our webinar series, and would like to say thank you, thank you, thank you, Heather, to you, because you nailed it. You made it brilliant, because I think legal writing is the most difficult. Legal writing is much, much more, I think I can honestly say so. It is really extremely difficult skill to teach, to study, to acquire. And because in writing everything is seen, the logic of a person, the vocabulary, the education, so it's like a mirror. Well, not a mirror like a mirror, I think I can say. So everything,
sure.
Yeah, reflection of a person. And to acquire the skill is super difficult. And Heather, thank you so much, because you managed to guide us, yeah, through the most difficult elements. And basically I consider it to be like the plan. If someone would like to study deeper into this, you can just follow the topics of the 6 webinars that Heather has made. That's a program, her baby. And you will are it's can I say a beacon of light? A beacon. So, they are guidelines for you how you can improve your writing. So we are wrapping up.
I do hope that it's been informative, and I will say that teaching legal writing is also a lot of fun and very rewarding. It is a puzzle, and I love puzzles. So thank you very much, Sophia, for the opportunity, and thank you those who are watching for tuning in to see the series.
We are saying goodbye to you, so to you all, and all of the materials will be available. So now we switch to interactive session. Please do not forget about the test, and we will write about it. And bye bye everyone who are watching us online. Bye bye. See you.